My name is Tim McCarthy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Sexuality, Gender, and Human Rights program over at the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. I teach jointly here in the Yard in the History and Literature department, and also have an affiliation on the tutorial board at WGS, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And I also wear another hat, which is one of the hats that I'm proud to wear today, which is that I'm a board member for the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Caucus. And as many of you know, the caucus launched a very ambitious fundraising campaign a number of years ago to raise money, $1.5 million, to endow what has become the first ever chair in gender and sexuality studies in the country, and that is the F.O. Matheson Visiting Professorship in Gender and Sexuality. And Henry Abelove is our first Matheson chair. And so, wearing multiple hats, I wanted to take the occasion to welcome him here and to say how proud we are and how thrilled we are to have the chair actually in existence, and also the chair now filled. You are filling the chair, so the chair is in the chair. We're very, very happy to have that come to fruition. And I really thought, because there hasn't been a huge kind of rollout of Henry being here, I thought someone ought to have like a welcome party for him. And so this is about as fun a welcome party as we can muster up the energy and resources for around here, but it really is wonderful to be here. I should also say that this event is being co-sponsored not only by the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Caucus, but also by the Committee on Degrees and Studies of Women and Gender and Sexuality, and also by the Carr Center's program in Sexuality, Gender, and Human Rights. And so this is a kind of collaborative effort. And as this gentleman just asked me, we even came over here all the way from the Kennedy School to come to the Yard. So this is an opportunity for us to put into practice Drew Faust's aspirational vision of one Harvard. So here we are. Let me just give you a little bit of a background for those of you who don't know Professor Abelove. He is obviously the F.O. Matheson Visiting Professor of Gender and Sexuality at Harvard University. He's also the co-editor, and I'll talk more with him about this in a little bit, of the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, which is a landmark text in the field. He won the Lambda Prize. And he's also author of the book The Evangelist of Desire, a book about John Wesley and Methodism, and then also Deep Gossip. And he and I might even get into a little deep gossip later on if he's game about that. At Wesleyan University, where he taught for many, many years, first in the history department and then in the English department, he won the Binswanger Prize for excellence in teaching. He's a beloved and distinguished teacher, and we've seen that already here. At Princeton University, he served as the Stanley Kelly Jr. Visiting Professor for distinguished teaching. He's also taught at Brown University, NYU, Trinity College, and at Yale. He's teaching 2 courses here at Harvard this year, one on sexuality and intimacy in British literature, 1680 to 1815, and then also the history of sexuality, theory, and practice. And these are 2 very popular courses he's teaching here this fall. He's also working on 2 more books right now, one on colonialist fantasies in the 18th century Atlantic world, and another on the intellectual and cultural formations and dimensions of the gay liberation movement in New York City. And we'll talk a little bit more about his scholarship in a bit. But Henry, I've had lunch with him. We had lunch a couple weeks ago, and it was such a delight to finally meet you after all these years of knowing you by reputation. And we had a great conversation, so I'm hoping that we can reproduce some of that here and then take it to another level. But first of all, it is wonderful to welcome you here to Harvard.
I'm thrilled to be here, and of course honored to be appointed to this chair. Harvard seems to have changed a good deal since I left it in 1966. I'll just say.
Well, it's almost as if you knew what I was going to ask. So I want to go back to your sort of beginnings at this institution, which date from 1962 to 1966. One of the several years ago, the HGLC honored Marty Duberman, who I know you know very well. Who's also a pioneer in this field. And one of the things that Marty did when he accepted the award is he kind of had this off-the-cuff kind of living history of his time at Harvard. And he kind of dazzled the crowd with this very eloquent reminiscence of his time here, not always a positive reminiscence, but it was an interesting one. It seemed to, people really wanted to read it, so we recorded it and printed it in our newsletter and so forth. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what Harvard was like in those years. I'm a big proponent of capturing the kinds of memories and oral histories of trailblazers and other folks who have lived the history that so many of us, myself included, have only read about in many ways. So if you could take us back to those years and talk a little bit about what this place was like.
Those years of long ago. I don't feel like I was a trailblazer at Harvard College. I think I was a kind of lost and confused and shy, excruciatingly shy guy from the provinces. Harvard was very class-marked in that era, I think. It was also, of course, male. There was a separate college, Radcliffe, where we shared classes with Radcliffe students. Their world was still significantly apart from ours, and it was overwhelmingly white. I think I can best give you an idea of the class differential when I say that the rooms in the Harvard houses, as I recall, were differentially priced. So the best rooms were thought to be on the second floor, and the most well-to-do people could afford them. And if you were a scholarship student, as I was, you lived on the top floors, always. And so your residence defined your class position. I didn't have the concept gay or even homosexual. I think I knew about perverts, and I figured that's what I must be. There probably was a world of like-minded or similarly confused people at Harvard, but I didn't find it. It was always a mystery to me where they were. I did find sex. That was possible in the restrooms where it was commonly available, and for all I know, is still commonly available. But I had no social, cultural, or political group oriented around gayness to relate to.
Adam's House, the theater?
Well, I wasn't in Adam's house, and so I don't know what that would have been like, and nor was I in the theater, and as I say, I was shy, and I don't think I was very good at finding connections or people. Perhaps I should have been much more interested than I was. But it wasn't a world that seemed available to me or to any of my classmates with whom I have since reminisced. I went to a psychotherapist in Cambridge when I had my then, I think it was then usual to take a term or a year off to find your place in the world. Eric Erickson, one of our teachers then, called it a psychosocial moratorium. and it was recommended to all undergraduates. I've learned that it is no longer a commonly done thing. But when I did mine, I went to a psychotherapist here in Cambridge, a very distinguished person, I later learned, who, however, was sure when I talked to him about my sexual feelings that I couldn't possibly be a pervert or homosexual. He gave me that term as well. He simply told me that I was having something he called homosexual panic. And that as soon as I succeeded in dating a woman and having sex with a woman, I would be fine. I think that was the standard approach among psychotherapists in that era to young men like me. One other Harvard reminiscence, and then I'll stop. This may be more than you want to hear about that Harvard past. The commencement address is still in Latin, I'm told. My students have told me it's still in Latin. One of them. Yeah. And the one in my year was given by William Weld, who later became governor of Massachusetts. Yeah. He was a classics major. And it was a parodic speech about Radcliffe students. It's worth looking it up in the old Harvard archives. It was called De Puellis Radcliffeensibus. That sort of sexism was quite standard.
All right.
Does that give you the flavor? It seems different now.
It's quite different now. There are still vestiges of those old times, certainly. I was actually here in the last year or two of the Adams Pool, when it was the Adams Pool. I won't tell you how I went swimming, but I now go in, and it's now a theater. So every time I watch a student production of a show in the Adams Theater, I always have an out-of-body experience. But anyway, this is not about me. This is about you.
Experience in the past.
I wanted to talk for a minute about F.O. Matheson. We talked about Matheson at lunch that day. Matheson was a kind of legendary figure around here, someone who was known to live with a kind of so-called open secret, had a long-term lover, was someone who was a path-breaking scholar, founder of one of the founders of American Studies, wrote a classic text, American Renaissance, of course, that you know. But then, of course, had a tragic end to his life, or took his life, and ended a career and a life that was quite promising and remarkable. And yet, so few students around here know of Matheson now. They may have, in graduate seminars, read American Renaissance or critiques of American Renaissance, probably more likely. And there is a lore around Matheson at Eliot House. They have a Matheson dinner, which you're going to speak at, I know. And there's a drawer of his letters in the senior tutor's resident dean's office there that most people have never taken a look at. They have a Matheson room. What does Matheson's life and career, as you understand it, say to us today? What kinds of lessons can we draw either from his intellectual work or the way that he lived his life, the kinds of how he ended his life? How does his work, life, and legacy speak to us in the 21st century, which is such a different place in so many ways than the world that he inhabited?
Matheson was a radical. He liked to use that term to describe himself. I've read through his letters, which are actually, sorry to have to tell you, at Yale, the main letters. Yes, he was a Yale graduate, and Yale has them. And one of the hardest things for him, and one of the things that actually probably, in my opinion, precipitated his suicide, was in the very late 40s, at the height of the, I shouldn't say the height, the beginnings of the most intense period of the Red Scare in American history, when he was being attacked on all sides by the FBI, by the Harvard administration particularly, I should say, by the House Un-American Activities Committee, by columnists in the press. The thing that probably pushed him over the edge more than anything else was the way students started to reject him. Students who shared in the hysteria of the Red Scare, what seems to me to be the hysteria of the Red Scare. He had been the faculty advisor to a student group called the Progressive Union. It wasn't a trade union, it was just a student group. But the students in that group asked him to resign, told him that his services were no longer required. And the letter he wrote to them, very moving to read. He said that he never shared the views of the members of the group. They were liberals. He didn't think of himself as a liberal. He thought of himself as a radical. But he had always wanted to defend their right to be liberals at Harvard against a very conservative administration. And he was chagrined, he said in the letter, that they asked him to leave without even thanking him for services rendered. Those were the words he used. I'm telling you this story not to discredit or attack those students who, like all the rest of us, are moved by currents of opinion in the world around us and don't always have a good perspective on the degree to which we're moved by conventional opinion. But to indicate how important it was to him to identify as a man. He was president of the Harvard Teachers Union. That's one good thing at Harvard that no longer is, or so I understand. He was a fierce defender of the unionization efforts of the kitchen staff workers. So much so that when I was an undergraduate at Eliot House, long after he died, 13 years after he died, there were still faculty members who were furious about his advocacy of the unionizing efforts of the kitchen workers. One of them said to me when I asked him about Matheson, or Mattie as he was always called. When I asked him about Mattie, he said, "Oh, Mattie was a bore. He talked only about charwomen." He was very early committed feminist, early, I should say, in relation to most men of his generation, and very committed to anti-racism struggles as well. He was prominent in the Henry Wallace campaign, the Third Party campaign, 1948, and in fact gave a seconding speech at the convention. I suppose what I take away from my own acquaintance with him, which is only through letters and books, I never got to know him, his pride in his radicalism and a fascination with it and a wish to share in it. It's somehow vicarious. I think that's the heritage he would have wished to be remembered by.
And therefore would appreciate the irony of his name being attached to a chair.
To a chair.
That comes with a $1.5 million endowment. He would, as a literary scholar, would appreciate the irony of that
He would have
institutionalization.
appreciated many such ironies.
Yeah.
He might have looked askance at the notion that that the removal of the restriction on lesbian and gay people serving in the armed forces could be used as a pretext or a justification for the reinstitution of ROTC at Harvard. He was surely wrong
I wish he'd been around a year and a half ago for that rally. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned how he was an early feminist and relative to other men at the time, and that he was a proponent of anti-racism, and I've read that speech, so I actually listened to part of that speech that he gave in 48. And so often, one thing that the different fields of study that came out of the great transformations in the 1960s and 70s, black studies and women's studies and gay and lesbian studies, a kind of radical politics that suffused new intellectual formations. One of the things that these all have in common, in a sense, certainly from the perspective of historians or people who are trying to discover and craft an understanding of the past, is the attempt to restore to the historical record people and movements and communities and lived experiences that were erased from the historical record. They were always there, but historians ignored them. Right, to take seriously the perspectives of slaves and other African Americans, to take seriously the perspective of women, of gays and lesbians, of ordinary, everyday experiences, what Howard Zinn called the people's history. And so talk to me a little bit about the birth of those movements, intellectual movements, right, from the perspective of someone who watched them come into creation, who participated in their creation, And then I want to ask a follow-up question. What's missing still in the histories that we teach and tell?
Oh my goodness, so much, I suppose. Hard to say because it's precisely missing. But I guess I could say that I was intellectually nurtured here, and then in graduate school at Yale, but that I was shaped intellectually and politically by the social movements of the 1960s. I studied history here and in graduate school, but when I took history at Yale, English history was my line originally. My professors gave me tasks to do that I'm sure were good for my mental and thrift, but had very little bearing on anything I've ever done after, fortunately. I mean, for instance, I was required in the research seminar I took in English history to write biographies of every member of Parliament for a particular Cornish borough who sat between 1660 and 1690. That was what we did. So I learned how to do what I wanted to do in the social, or I made my original efforts to learn to do what I wanted to do in the social movements of the 60s. For me, particularly in feminism and in gay liberation, where I was most involved. And it was a world that was, for us in the 60s, the 70s, more in the 70s for me than in the 60s, actually. The movements began in the 60s, but I was ready to join them in the 70s. It was a world that was filled with intellectual activity. Just thinking now back about the journals, and I recently talked to Pam Matheson in the library, who I see there in the audience, about the importance of acquiring such journals now for the library. Journals like Fag Rag, which was published here in Boston. And we don't have it in the Harvard Library as far as I know.
I would go to the library every day if Fag Rag were in the library. If you need another person to recommend that we purchase that, yes, please do.
There were for me, science was very important. We had that at the library. We that started in '75, as I recall. There were journals like The Body Politic, which came out of Toronto, Gay Sunshine, which came out of Los Angeles, Man Root. There was Gay Left that came out of London, and so these journals were intensely movement-oriented, but also culturally and intellectually forward. A lot of the initiatives in history and in cultural studies came from community groups too, which were also political groups, like the Boston Lesbian and Gay History Project, which produced a slideshow, a remarkable slideshow. I actually hope that some of the students in my History of Sexuality course this year will take a look back at that slideshow to try and answer precisely the question you asked. What wasn't done then? What still needs to be done? Or what was done wrongly as well as rightly done? It's a very important question. We taught ourselves variously in the movement. For me also, the Radical History Review. We had a collective, we called it, in New Haven, and another in New York, which took turns, and one in Boston, which took turns in editing different issues of the Radical History Review. When some colleagues of mine and I came to try to produce the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, which came out in 1993, nearly 20 years ago now, the object was really to put together some of what we taught ourselves in social movements and what others had written in these social movements, largely in these social movements, rarely because of university work or university coursework and make it available so that it could become a basis for courses to be taught in universities. That was the plan. That was the thought. I think now publication is, there's a lot of publication coming along in queer studies and transgender studies, related directly or indirectly to almost all the disciplines. It's no longer possible for me to know even most of it. When we edited the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, my job, or one of my jobs, was to do the bibliography. It was a bibliographical essay at the end of it. And in order to do that, I had to read for about a year and a half or 2 years. But at the end of that reading, I thought I had read, at least in the languages I know, everything that was there to be read. And maybe I had. I don't know. Or maybe I was kidding myself. But nobody, I can't do that now. Nobody else can. And either, as far as I know. And that's why I hardly know how to answer the question about what's missing. I don't even know all of what's there.
Yeah.
I have a sense, I think most of us who are in the field have a sense that there's a whole lot to be done in the area of transgender studies that hasn't been done. That's just a sense. I think that I myself have a feeling that too much of the current work and coursework is contemporary. I worry about that. I worry about the
Why do you worry about that?
the
That's
lack
an
of
important point, I think.
perspective. I mean, it's what we meet in our studies, or what we should want to meet again and again, is difference, and confront it seriously, all kinds of difference, and the difference that the past offers us is as important as all the other kinds. So I think about that, the past, and not just the more familiar pasts, the American past, the European past, but the pasts that I was never taught in Asia and Africa, Latin America. Those pasts too. I was recently asked by the editors, and by the publishers, pardon me, of the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader at Routledge, if I would like to do a new edition with the
I was actually just gonna, that's where I was gonna go, that's what I was gonna ask.
And I said no. The other editors, one said yes and one said no. My thinking was, there's now so much that if we were to try to do it, we would really be producing a canon. And I jib at that. I don't like the idea of producing the approved works in the field. I like the original project of trying to make what we had then available for courses. And we did, and it worked. There were courses.
It's interesting you say that. I actually want to dig into that a little bit more, because there is a certain kind of project of creating a canon whenever you do an anthology, the whatever reader.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm actually starting with this right now, because 10 years ago I did a book called The Radical Reader, which was an attempt to create a kind of history, a documentary history of American radicalism. And I was always sort of resisting that, which you can only pick 150 texts, like which 150 texts represent this. Is it one American radical tradition or multiple radicalisms, right? And if it's a radical project, how dare it attempt to create some kind of tradition or canon, right? And you must have wrestled with that as well, right? When you're putting together the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, it is a project of consolidation, of creating a standard text, which it, of course, has become. So how did you wrestle with that then? I mean, I know what I wrestled with, because this is my first book deal, and I needed the publication, so I'm like, I'm going to do this, right? So, and I did, and it was fine, or we did, my co-editor, John McMillan and I. So you wrestle with that at the time, but then, looking back 10 years, 20 years, how do you do you see it differently now? Did you see it as a more radical attempt to create something new and to put it on the map then, but now it's become something that's a little bit more of a canonical text and it troubles you now? Or is it your own age? What is it?
My own age, my own declining capacity for enjoyment. I don't know, maybe that was part of the no I said to the publisher. We didn't think we were producing a canon then, maybe we were naive. We thought we were gathering together fugitive pieces that would have been very hard for teachers to find and to use, much less to deploy in a book, unless we had done it for them. We thought they were like us. They were people who wanted to teach courses in this line, but who hadn't themselves been taught. And we also thought that the kinds of work we hope to put together into this anthology, the kind of work in English language was still rare, hard to find, very fugitive. There were people like Gail Rubin, seemed to us to be an absolutely crucial figure, who'd never had an academic publication. Over the years, a lot of what Gail published was published in bar rags, what we call bar rags, that is, free giveaways in bars that were mostly advertisements. Much of her bibliography until her recent book, Deviations, came out was still only to be found by people who could search in places like that. So at that time, we thought, rightly or wrongly, that we were bringing together stuff that was pretty rare and that wouldn't have been easily found otherwise. At this point, my feeling is certainly very different. And although I told the Routledge people, but they paid no attention to me, and why should they? I don't know anything about the economics of publishing. That what I would be willing to participate in was a series of the making of a series of anthologies on focused topics, where there's enough material to
like
make
a general editor of the series.
Yeah, or to help them find particular editors even without being the general editor. I don't need to be a general editor, or even a kernel editor. It would have been all right. Maybe something on queer anarchism. Who knows? Or something on a student recently was asking me about linguistics and gender, something about linguistics and gender, and very particular stuff. But then I wouldn't feel as though we were trying to produce the final word, a canon, the official guide. It would still be a case of gathering all the relevant articles together in one place.
Right. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about the institutionalization of sexuality studies, gender and sexuality studies, women's studies, LGBT studies, because this is a difficult project, and it's a project that has at its core kind of political charge, right? Coming out of the idea that studying these things and having analytical frameworks around gender and race and sexuality and so forth is important to understanding culture, politics, the past, institutions, power, etc. And yet there's a deep resistance to these projects in the academy. And part of the history of that is a history of resistance and counter-resistance. And since you were someone who was a part of that, and since all of us who are in this institution right now are part of that, whether we know it or not, because the histories of resistance and counter-resistance continue. Talk to us a little bit about that project and how difficult it is, how you go about it strategically, how you've gone about it, your frustrations.
Well, I've gone about it blindly. As I said, coming out of these these social movements and these efforts of mutual education. I first offered a history of sexuality course in the academic year 84, 85. That was the beginning for me. The resistances I saw then are still the resistances I see now. And there are a whole bunch of them. One of them is the embarrassment and anxiety that colleagues feel when you say you want to give a course on sexuality. Freud somewhere says that among Kulturmenschen, I don't know how to translate that, what is that, civilized people, cultured people, the tendency when sexuality comes up is to oscillate sharply between prudery and lasciviousness, those two responses. And faculties are filled with Kulturmenschen. Just this year, I had to go to a special class on how to operate the eyesights because I'm a computer idiot. And they have very helpful classes at information technology. And there was another faculty member there, a very nice person, doesn't matter what department, who asked me what I was teaching, and I said the history of sexuality. And he responded with the same nervous joke that I have heard at every institution I've taught at Wesleyan, at Brown, at Princeton, at NYU, at Trinity College, at Hartford, every place, the same joke. I said, I'm teaching a history of sexuality course, and he said, oh, we need more of that at Harvard.
And he may be right.
On many levels. He wasn't talking about the course. And I made the same response I've learned to make. I always make when this joke is said to me. I'm teaching only the history of sexuality. Another problem apart from, and a closely related problem apart from the anxiety and embarrassment this produces, is that, at least in our familiar cultural world, sexuality is private, whereas other things, it officially is supposed to be private. Other things like economics, politics, law, reason, medicine, science, these are public. These are matters for public concern. I think it's an important strategy to make sexuality studies public. And to try and resist the tendency to relegate it to a private realm. At Wesleyan, the students used to have kiss-ins. I thought they were helpful in a way, obscurely, indirectly, for trying to. They used to attend to the. Are there tours for aspirant students at Harvard? Mm-hmm. They used to attend the tours and kibitz from the sidelines about the importance of treating sexuality as a public matter, or held up signs saying that if you come to Wesleyan, you could have sex with me, something like that. I like almost.
Which could explain why the student body at Wesleyan has a different kind of orientation than the student body at Harvard.
I like. These are trivial. Maybe they're trivial. I like almost any efforts to try and counter the tendency to treat sexuality as something private. Another resistance, of course, is in the preconception that sexuality, insofar as it's a topic, it belongs to the sciences only. Zygotes are a scientific matter. When I first gave the history of sexuality course at Wesleyan, one of my colleagues in biology gave a counter course, which he called the history of sexuality, which he offered in the same time frame during the academic day, in order to make the point. And I think that resistance is still there, the sense that insofar as this is a topic at all, it's a topic that belongs in the sciences. Then there's the recognition that the push for sexuality studies has come not exclusively but very largely from LGBT people, and so all the prejudices and fears and hatreds about us come into the equation. And Wesleyan in the 80s, when I first started teaching, one of my colleagues who was very angry about the course, a lot of colleagues were angry about the course and actually stopped talking to me. One of them took me aside and said, you know, Henry, I think we should have, in faculty hiring, an affirmative action program for married people. Married people, this was well before we were talking at all about marriage. And I said, Dick, why should we have an affirmative action program for married people? And he said, because married people care about other human beings. I, of course, was completely inept and couldn't think of anything to say back to him, though I thought of many things in the ensuing years. But what he was doing was responding with anger and hatred to me, to my association with the course, to the field. These feelings are there. They aren't always expressed quite so directly as he expressed it. And then there's a final problem about institutionalizing these courses. I realize I haven't said yet much about how you counter these attitudes. I will try to say something about that in a moment. And that's that these fields have brought a great deal of methodological and theoretical innovation in their wake. And there's resistance to the theoretical innovation as well, especially at universities, more at universities than in colleges. And that's because the universities are the guardians of graduate education and are inevitably relatively conservative about the field, each field that each graduate program nurtures and protects. And all of these attitudes combine to create resistance to institutionalization of the program. What I think is, this isn't very helpful, I know, that people who have the power to offer courses, at some institutions that's only tenured people, at other institutions it includes untenured people, I think we should push forward and offer them, and bear the brunt of the hostility, and expect the hostility too. It's something I think we should do as soon as we feel secure enough in our own beings and position to do it. And I think that that students should take these courses and not be afraid of them. Sometimes students are afraid of them. Boys in particular, I might add, because of the built-in notion in American masculinity, at least as I learned it, that we're supposed to already know about. There's nothing yet to learn. I think that's a paraconscious or maybe conscious or even sometimes unconscious attitude. So I think there's a responsibility on the part of teachers and students in this matter. One thing I should add is that although it's been very hard to institutionalize courses, it hasn't been, in recent years, hard to publish books in this field. When I first started, everyone turned down my essays uniformly. I had rejections across the board from everybody. And I can't even recall how many publishers and how many journals. Somewhere I think I have a file of the letters I kept just out of spite or anguish or some such thing. But now the presses haven't been doing well financially, and books that thematize sexuality actually sell a little bit better than other academic books. No surprise there. And so publishers are more willing to take them. But it hasn't translated into jobs. And it hasn't translated into career making for those who are in this field. So recently, when I read a book review in the London Review of Books by a very prominent literary scholar named Terry Eagleton, who was making fun of what he took to be the popularity of sexuality studies, reviewing a book favorably, but with an attitude, because he pretended in this review to suggest that this book was going to be great for this guy's career. He actually said, the last sentence of the review, the full professorship in multiple orgasms can't be far behind. That was an incredible bad faith. The position which I have the honor to hold here, it's the only one in the country that's endowed.
And it's a visiting.
And it's a visiting professorship. So that was really in bad faith. But the fact that books can be published has led some people to those kinds of acts of bad.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on something you said, because you took us through an interesting set of locations. One was with respect to the history of sexuality and the institutionalization of these ways of learning and studying and so forth. And one was anxiety, right? The anxiety that elicits the silly joke that you've heard over and over again, the uncomfortable laughter. One is the sort of sense that this should only be studied in a particular place. So one's a kind of anxiety and sort of terrible humor. Another one is this should only be studied here. It shouldn't be studied here, here, here. And then you got to something that I was hoping you would get to, which is the deep-seated prejudice against the very people who are being studied and understood and heard for the first time often, and also the people who seek to push for that to happen. Right? So often in black studies, it was black people who were pushing for that. In women's studies, it was women who were pushing for that. In LGBT studies, it was gay and lesbian folks, queer folks who were pushing for that. And so the anxiety becomes this sort of almost respectable and passable form of articulating a prejudice which is more deeply seated, which is really at the root of it all.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. At the root of it all. And one of the things that I worry about institutionally, particularly when we think about the kind of fusing together or the bringing together of gender and sexuality studies, of a kind of women's studies formation with the LGBTQ formation, bringing them together, is that actually puts all of us in one place. So the folks who are actually subjected to sexism and patriarchy are in the same place as the folks who are being subjected to homophobia and transphobia. Now we're all together, and they know where we all are, right? We're all in the basement in Boylston Hall, together with the new Office for BLGBTQ Studies, Student Life, etc. And so I wonder whether or not, because the building coalitions, of intellectual coalitions as well as political coalitions, which I think anybody involved in these forms of study have to understand that these are two intellectual and political projects at once, right? So the formation of these coalitions to bring together the work that we're doing, to create productive tensions intellectually and politically, but also to form lines of solidarity within institutions that are hostile to us, become these places that are perhaps more easily marginalized. I wonder what you think about that. Is there power in coming together and creating not only interdisciplinary, but kind of methodological kinds of spaces that we can push for and have more power to push for institutionalization, departmentalization, etc.? Or does that create a kind of coalition which is more easily dismissed because now the women and the queers, the feminists, the blacks, they're all together, right? They're all over here. And now we can actually dehumanize and diminish and discount this entire project more easily. I don't know. I'm throwing that out there as a provocation.
I think you're right. I mean, the answer is yes, yes. It's both more empowering and more troubling and dangerous. The coalition has gone farther at NYU, uniquely, I think, only at NYU as far as I know. There's now a department called Social and Cultural Analysis that includes LGBT studies, it includes feminist studies, it includes ethnic studies, it includes African American studies, it includes Asian and Pacific Islander studies. It's all there in one huge department. And you can see the results there even more clearly, I think. I taught there as a visitor this semester before I came to Harvard. That coalition, that grouping, that intellectual grouping, has taken an intellectual and political leadership of the university that's been extraordinarily fruitful and important for I think, for students and for the faculty. It's also despised by a lot of the faculty and by the administration. It played a big role in the unionization efforts of the graduate students that department did, which was predictable, but created an animosity that certainly hasn't yet dissipated.
That's right.
There are questions all the time about how that marginalization detracts from opportunities for them at the same time as it enables them in various ways. I had one colleague there told me they were all crazy. Every single one of them in SCA was crazy. They seemed to mean to say that to me, actually. I don't know what I should have been surprised. Again, I don't know that there's a solution, a singular pathway to follow. Dispersal, congregation, both have advantages. I have to give you the cop-out answer that strategies probably are best related to particular institutions.
Yes.
And you need to know your institution well to understand the best way to cope.
And I've always been of the mind that if you're going to go into a fight, go into the fight with the best people and the most number of people that you can. I want to ask you one final question, and we'll open it up for the folks here to ask you questions and participate. You are, Emily, you can't leave yet, so I was just going to gesture at you. No, you can do this. This is one of my former students, who's now a graduate student here, is one of my most brilliant students. I just want to flatter her before she leaves the room. But you're also someone who takes teaching very seriously, and you know, and you can leave after I say this, that teachers who are committed to teaching and who understand teaching in the deepest sense, understand that you learn at least as much as you teach. And so you can leave now, because I've learned a lot from her. What are you learning from your students these days, right? You were here almost 50 years ago, right? And the student, you said a lot has changed. What are you learning from contemporary students who are interested in queer studies, who are interested in feminism, who are interested in the histories that you and I are so compelled by? What are you learning from them these days that you never would have imagined given your start?
Well, it depends on the period when I would do it.
She's going to be late for a meeting.
Please feel free. I really do learn something from almost every verbal exchange with the student. That isn't saying that is not an affectation. Well, I'm sure it sounds like an affectation, I'm so open to it. It's not. I don't think I am particularly open. I think that they batter through even my defenses quite successfully. The ideas and interests are different from the ones I've cultivated over the years. and they bring them to bear in their papers and in their discussions. And sometimes they aren't even aware that what they're saying is new to me, I think. The biggest new theme is transgenderism, and very important intellectually and politically now to students. And I've learned a lot about it from them, not as much as I hope yet to learn. But when we did the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, none of the editors were thinking about it. I know that. I know that because we had extensive discussions about what we were thinking about. We had decided, for instance, when we were doing a reader, that 2/3 of the contributors would be women. And they were. And we did that quite deliberately out of a sense that men had dominated the public discourse in the very nascent public discourse in the field. And it shouldn't be so. And that if we told ourselves in advance that 2/3 of the contributors would be women, that we would indeed find the contributors with good, strong articles, the right mix of fields and so on and so forth, field disciplines. But we didn't talk about multiple genders among ourselves, or anything like that. We didn't know to. So that's one thing I'm learning. I'm learning a lot. I mean, this is so obvious. About popular cultures in which I have no grounding. Both musical and performance popular cultures. Some of my own students in queer studies have gone on to do work in performance studies. Quite a few of them actually are teaching performance studies now. And I've learned a great deal about that field from them. I don't know it from my own reading or study or even experientially the way they do.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So those would be
okay.
Two big examples.
Good. Well, let's open it up for questions. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
When you were talking about history and background, there was the one institute in Los Angeles with Evelyn Hooker, and they attempted to get an archive and a whole study situation. Is that ever incorporated?
The One Institute, which was an early homophile effort, is now in the possession of the University of Southern California, USC. And it's part of their library system. Most of the papers haven't yet been cataloged, but they're available for researchers. And anyone who wants to research there can do so. I understand they're very welcoming.
Other questions?
Comments?
Come on. Yeah.
So going back to the discussion of sort of the academy and the direction in which I think the academy is, I'm curious to know, where do you think, so when I was looking at doctoral programs, some of my advisors said, we know that you have a passion for critical ethnic studies, but you can't get a job. So you have to stay within sociology, anthropology, literature, whatever the sort of traditional old guard fields are. But you see a lot of the rifts happening even within some of those fields as well. So like a lot of comp lit has sort of emerged and blossomed into something very much different from what a lot of the other sort of old guard established sort of fields have become. Do you think, sort of from a bird's eye view, do you see the academy moving in any direction, or do you think that the traditional fields will sort of shore themselves up?
They certainly always are shoring themselves up. And I had a queer studies student who did an American studies degree and tried to get jobs in sociology departments and has failed to do so, even though he has beautiful work and extensive publication. Now that's just an example. I think there are lots of such examples. But somehow I don't think, unfortunately I know many people who are in similar positions in relation to other disciplines, including history, for instance. But somehow I don't think the answer is to stay within the disciplines. If I was in you, the first thing I would have said is I don't give any advice. And then the second thing I would have said would no doubt have been to give you advice, which would have been to go right into critical ethnic studies and push those departments and keep pushing them. It's risky, and that's why I wouldn't want to give you any advice. It's for someone else to take risks. But the rigidities of the departments worry me. I will say this, that colleges are better than universities at accommodating these intellectual ventures for the reason I gave before. And departments at colleges are often better at accommodating these ventures than universities are. If your heart is set on teaching at a Research One university, then the disciplines may be your only path. If a teaching college sounds good to you, I think there's no fear.
Other questions? I'm going to start calling people. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This has really been very interesting. This is more of a comment. It is a comment, not a question. I want to encourage you to do the second edition of the anthology. I actually just did a second edition of the History of Sexuality anthology. Different though than yours. It's documents and articles, and it was much easier the second time around. And also, I didn't feel at all like I was creating a canon. That didn't even cross my mind actually. So I'm interested to hear that was your hesitation about it. I felt like it was my way of putting out my take out there for what I think will inspire lively classroom discussion. And after so many years of teaching, I feel like I know pretty much like what makes for an interesting discussion. Yeah. And then I did the work of gathering all the things to make it easier for other faculty to use it in the class. So I want to just offer that as a
okay. Well, I'll take that.
Well, as a footnote to that,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think the problem lies with the initial article. If you didn't call it the Gay and Lesbian Studies Reader and just called it a Gay and Lesbian Studies Reader.
Or yet another.
The first of many to come, Gay and Lesbian Studies Reader.
Yeah, I think that I called mine American Sexual Histories.
Yeah.
So to just kind of give that sense of,
I like that.
there's many histories going on.
I like that title.
I called mine a documentary history of the American radical tradition.
But I don't think we could be satisfied with the terms gay and lesbian either. We'd have to rethink that as well. Mm-hmm. If we take your advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Good comments, questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, is there any literature about the straight people, the straight people,
yes,
who actually were seminally necessary for some of where we are today to be here, that took the homosexuality out of the DSM-IV manual? Mm. You know, it was James Roosevelt who wrote the Gay Rights Bill in Massachusetts. Right. And I think it's fascinating to wonder.
Margaret Marshall wrote the Good.
I'm not trying to suggest that I don't know where they belong, right. But it seems to me that there's a very, very interesting study there. That I would like to know a lot more about those folks.
Friends and supporters.
Can I just add on to that? Because I think that's a really interesting point, particularly now, because on college campuses now, I'm the advisor to most of the queer student groups at the Kennedy School of College. And one of the things that they're always talking about, making events now more than ever, last 2 or 3 events, ally friendly, right? We can make sure the allies come. We're going to give buttons to the allies they can wear around campus and all this stuff. And this has become a political and social strategy among people who are inhabiting colleges and universities now. And there have been in other movements, particularly in the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Black freedom struggle more broadly, there's a whole series of scholarly articles and books and so forth in the interracialism of these movements and the racial dynamics of the movements and how crucial, not that white people were leading the movements, but that they were crucial allies positioned in different ways and so forth. So yeah, what do you say about that? That's a question.
I think it's important in and of itself, but it hasn't been neglected. I mean, it is written about in all the standard movement histories. I should probably add that movement histories are out of fashion. So we aren't seeing movement histories in the way we used to. When they are produced, they tend to be popular rather than academic or scholarly nowadays. But insofar as there are movement histories, they're very much I've always thought that the courses I give, even when the courses, I've given some courses that were not just history of sexuality. I've given courses on, for instance, the culture of gay liberation, very specifically about a big topic. I've always felt that the courses were for all students, and the history of enrollment suggests that that's the way the students see it too. I can't know how my students identify, insofar as they do identify sexually. For sure, but at a small place like Wesleyan, I had a pretty good idea. And my impression was that I had more straight identified students than queer identified students in these courses over the years.
Okay.
I'm curious about the different silos.
I'm sorry, I
I'm
couldn't.
curious about the different silos in some sense.
Silos. Yeah.
Like in the cast of characters, so you take historical characters like sexual inversion or perverts that you name, that were around as names that floated between who we were.
Right.
And now we're into LGBTQIA, and we're moving into different silos, and I'm wondering if you could speculate about how we even think about sex, gender, and sexuality differently.
Yeah.
Or has they come together? And I'll preface it as a person who has been a heterosexual woman, has been a lesbian, and now a trans guy that completely doesn't understand sexual orientation in any way that fits me.
Yeah, right.
Over my lifetime. And so, I mean, it's a personal struggle in my own work and who I am, but I'm curious your own speculation about how we put these things together and rearrange them.
That's
as we're talking, because we're not just doing these things, at least some of us aren't.
Yeah.
No, none of us, I suspect. It's a hot topic intellectually right now. And I suppose one way of describing it as a topic, and it's also a matter of urgent personal concern for us, for I think all of us who are present and alive at this moment, but and who want to think about it. One of the ways of describing it as a topic is the history of thinking about sexuality and gender and sex. As a topic, I've just been teaching it through Joan Wallach Scott's book, The Fantasy of Feminist History. I think it is it the second chapter? I don't know. That tries to offer a tentative history of the way, for her it's just of the way American and French feminists have variously thought about these topics from the beginning of her career, her own career. She's now about 71, I think, to the present. And It's a very provocative, it's a very controversial, and exciting chapter, and it is not going to be the last word on this topic. I would predict a deluge of scholarship that coming soon that tries to help us understand both the past and present of our feeble efforts at conceptualizing over the years these issues. Feeble and invariably unsatisfactory. And tentative. That's why what you call silos, the silos keep changing.
Can I actually put my public policy hat on for a second? Because this is a question that I wrestle with, frankly. I don't have an answer. That's why I'm going to ask it as a question. That the birth of, or the genesis of, and I use those terms intentionally, the LGBT studies, women's studies, etc., were, as we've talked about, political. They had a political dimension to the very important political charge at the core of that intellectual project. And I think it still has that, or at least it should. And yet, much of the scholarship that we've been talking about, the deluge of scholarship that you're predicting, the scholarship that has come in the wake of your publishing your book in 1993 and the book that you've done and so forth, has been impressive, theoretically sophisticated, life-altering for lots of us, challenging for the rest of us. And yet, one criticism of the criticism is that it speaks a language that is not quite fully resonant with the broader culture. I'm putting it politely. Right? That it's impenetrable, to use another intentional word that's fraught with all sorts of meaning. That it's impenetrable and it doesn't speak to a broader kind of politics or a broader kind of culture. And I'm wondering what you think of that, whether you think that criticism is valid. I'll lay my cards on the table and say I think it is. And I wonder what but more importantly than that, because that's kind of a tired debate, right? Oh, you're writing for 15 people in a journal and not for the broader public. Those are tired academic intellectual debates that we've had for forever. But the more important piece speaks to what you were asking, is that we live in a world now where gender and sexuality and sex is proliferating, where it is unstable, where these boundaries that we all thought, many of us thought were fixed, or had been fixed, or we had the perception that they were fixed, are not. They're deeply unstable, they're troubling, they're provocative, they change, shift before our eyes. People themselves transform and transition in all sorts of ways that are thrilling and also terrifying to all sorts of people. And so when I do political work, right, when I go into the political realm, right, I mean, I testified before the working group on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with all the caveats that you mentioned at the very beginning. And I mean, they couldn't even wrap their heads around what to do with the showers, with the gay troops who read Masculine and Straight. They weren't even talking about intersex folks and transgender folks, and obviously who were not part of the repeal, right? And there's a reason for that, right? That was not a queer liberation moment for us. That was the repeal of a discriminatory law for gays and lesbians who did not trouble gender expressions and gender norms and gender binaries, etc., to say nothing of sexuality and sex. And so I'm wondering, how do we, this really bothers me, it worries me, how do we take the insights that are theoretical and sophisticated and troubling and terrifying of our disciplines and our interdisciplines and literally translate them into a politically potent and powerful language to do battle to liberate us in the public sphere, which is being governed by a whole bunch of people that can't even begin to wrap their head around what you just said or who you are. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you know what I'm saying? Or who we are, frankly. And that, so I'm wondering, like, how do we take the intellectual and the personal and make it political in a way that actually gives us power? You want to follow up on that? Yeah.
Well, for my own work, I deal in religion, and specifically Christianity. And so it seems like what is stable is the opposition.
Yes.
The Church of England, in their current fight on tolerance, is coming back to the language of complementarity, coming out of Roman Catholicism, and that, you know, if we look at that over the last 100 years, that is a stable narrative from sex all the way to birth control. And it connects all the various, if I can use it collectively, widely queer bodies as the opposition to this narrative. So that at least within the context of Christianity and religion, the hegemonic narrative has remained as in place and being defended. The way we think of the queer bodies hitting up against that is continually rearranging itself.
Right. Not just queer bodies, queer lives, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah. Both, yeah.
So I don't know whether that helps in a political context in that way or not. I don't know.
Solve it for us, Henry.
Yeah.
You're the Matheson chair.
You know, I have been involved in political action groups of many different kinds, and still am. But I also think of my teaching as political, unabashedly. I don't feel any reserve about that. That doesn't mean that in teaching I'm advancing a particular line. I don't think so. I think I'm trying to produce heightened awareness and critical reflection on a range of topics and issues that seem to me politically germane. And I do strive for clarity there, and I hope that I strive for it in my writing too.
Yeah.
But right now, just talking about the teaching, I hope that counts for in the world, for students, for others, as a political intervention that is about helping to produce access to best thinking and reflection on this topic publicly. I think of teaching as a public act. My own writing, I do hope is clear, but I know this, that I will take the criticism that's unclear from anyone and change it immediately if I can to make it better. I do also want to defend, I've tried for a voice, a relatively public voice in my writing, but I would like to defend, against what you said, the rights of those whose voices is a little more arcane. It's the same in any field, really. Sometimes specialists have to talk to one another before they can talk to anyone else to work out disagreements and difficulties. And it wouldn't be possible for me to read an essay in microbiology. I wouldn't know how. And I wouldn't expect to know how. And it doesn't bother me that the microbiologists have to communicate among themselves. Eventually, as their work impinges on issues of public health and medicine, they will have to find a way to talk to others as well. Yeah. Or some of them will have to find a way to do that. But I don't mind that they have to talk among themselves. Yeah. And I think that there are queer studies specialists who do also need to talk among themselves.
Yeah, no, I call it acts of public translation. Like we would have to do it anyway. But if you're communicating across different language barriers, or across like community or cultural rituals, across disciplinary expertise, there's always an act of public translation when you take whatever is your disciplinary expertise or cultural practice or what have you, linguistic norm, to try to communicate with someone who doesn't have that is an act of public translation, right? Even if it's not two different languages, it's two different realms of understanding. And I don't think it has to be one or the other. My point is, when you do, as someone who has tried to publicly translate some of this, I run up against, pushback all the time from really well-intentioned people. I'm not just talking about the kind of the stable and static opponents. I'm talking about people who want to help but don't know what to call us, want to be in solidarity but don't know where we stand, right? Want to understand us and love us but aren't sure whether or not we're going to be the same person a year from now. Or
Who
5
are
years.
we?
And I'm not sure that, I think there's also something deeply subversive and radical about never being stable or stabilizable, right? I think there's something radical about that, but from a political standpoint, when folks are saying, look, I'm willing to work with you to pass this policy that's going to make life better for at least some of you, and I can't translate that, that may be my failure, but I also wonder, it's a challenge.
I think it is a challenge. I think it can be done properly. There's a community center in Burlington, Vermont. I haven't seen it yet. I've only had a letter from a friend about it. That would have been called, I think, a queer community center a few years ago, or even earlier, a lesbian, gay, bisexual community center, which is now named only by 2 letters and 2 numbers. RU12.
Yeah.
Having actually interviewed to the executive director of RU12, I should say that the name is actually from the late 80s.
Yeah.
So
It's been around, but now it seems appropriate.
Do you have anything?
Can you tell us more about it, or?
I actually think it's more of a nod to when gay bars were in scandals and whispers than it's subversive. But that's my personal take.
You don't think it's a politically adventurous move?
I don't find it particularly transgressive in the way that I would like it to be.
Scandals and whispers. We should start a bar called Scandals and Whispers, right?
Yeah, I think you did both.
You break my
Actually,
heart.
it should be deep gossip.
Yeah, deep gossip and other.
Deep gossip is actually not about gossip.
Right.
Though I must say that the title caused me trouble with the poet John Ashbery because I quoted 2 lines from one of his poems, and I had to get his permission you have to get permission when you quote poetry. And because of the title of the book, he asked to have a précis of every chapter before he would give permission for me to quote his poems. I think he wanted to be sure that there actually wasn't any gossip about him, in the book. But I prefer, despite what you tell me, and I'm sure you're right, I prefer to think of the name of this community center as a forward move.
Go ahead.
Yes, in talking about the history of sexuality, sexuality is a very personal thing, or it's between 2 people. And now we have a fascinating revolution taking place called the social network. Now, is this our blogs and the social network a game changer?
Well, first of all, I guess I don't agree with you that sexuality is saliently personal and between 2 people. So I can't accept the premise. But I have no doubt that social networking is making all sorts of impacts on the contemporary understanding and experience of sexuality. I say this at a great distance from it all, since I'm not on Facebook. You won't find me there, and since I only this semester acquired for the first time a cell phone, and only because there wasn't a phone jack in the apartment I rented here in Boston. I had to have one. So I'm a little out of it. On the other hand, I've just read a really strong manuscript for a university press on internet sex. So out of it as I am, I'm suddenly an expert, or so to say. At least the press consulted me as an expert. it's an anthropological study of internets, an ethnographic study, and it's very good. And what I've learned, I think, from this book is that modes of sociability, exchange, communication, understanding are shifting in many ways, as you suggest. But I think I must leave it to the author of the book to say how, since I'm at such a distance from all this.
Yeah.
Just like to add to this comment, I think that the internet is a game changer for historians too, because just today, something is going viral. I emailed it to Ian that shows you how quickly historians can get their work out there if it's the right thing in the right way. You know that famous photograph after World War II of the sailor holding the woman back?
Yeah.
Did people see this online
There's
today?
a new one, yeah.
No.
Well, and somebody wrote an article, and I can't think of the author's name right now. They found who that woman was, and she said, that was not a kiss between two lovers. I have no idea who that guy was, and I didn't want to kiss him, and he grabbed me in a aggressive, rape culture kind of a way, and, we all, the context in which that picture is in, it's just so celebratory, the war is over, isn't this great?
It's the freedom kiss, right? The victory
freedom kiss, right?
kiss.
And this person who did the history on this said, no, the history is actually different. Let's look to see what the woman says. Let's put this in a different context. And to me, that's why the internet can be a game changer, because this person wrote this, 500-word essay or whatever it was. And I've been sharing it with all my friends on Facebook. People are sending it to me. Have you seen this? And so I think in that way, the historians will be able to, maybe to make a little difference. Because if that guy had written, that guy or woman, whoever wrote the article had written a book about that, how many people are going to read it? Hardly anybody. But now, tons of people.
And, I'm looking at the friends who have shared it, for me, and I'm looking, this is an image that we've all seen a gazillion times, and I'm looking at it, and you realize, you look at the sailor's left arm, forcing her into the kiss. I've never seen, it completely changes how I look at this image.
Absolutely. And her arm, she's not embracing him, her arm is just kind of hanging there.
Yes, but it's been brought up because of the gay marine.
Yeah.
It's been paired with that.
Right, because there was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There was a similar image that was staged between a gay marine and his lover, which was an actual. They were partners, and they were now able to be public about it. And so they reproduced in the same Times Square, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they reproduced in Times Square the same image on the day of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So this is fascinating, right? This sort of the pairing, this idea of like victory or liberation or progress, and this iconic image, which is meant to actually be a symbol of a new form of liberation or repeal of discrimination, is actually based on an image that was actually coerced and forced and has a much different history. That's fascinating.
In a very public setting.
In a very public setting.
As public as you can get.
Right.
Within the moment and afterwards.
I want to just add a footnote. This is a much less scholarly point, but last year I was part of a delegation of LGBT academics and intellectuals and activists, cultural workers to Palestine, Israel. And we were in Palestine, and I remember we had gone through a briefing with several of the LGBT rights organizations there, and they told us, a lot of things about kind of cultural norms around gender and sexuality and relationships and sex and so forth, and sort of how to speak about it and how to operate as a group, because we were a group of queers from the United States, 16 of us, and we were not subtle in any way, in the way that we, I was one of the quietest and more unassuming people in this group. My husband said to me, he's like, oh my God, I would love to see a group of 60 people where you aren't the diva. I was like, yeah, well, there it is. So we were there, and one of the things that we wanted to know, one of the members of our group, a gay man, a very prominent journalist, said, I wonder if Grindr works here, he said.
Must have been Richard King.
No, it wasn't Richard King, because he lost his iPhone in television. Yeah, he lost my phone at a gay bar with me and television. That's another story. We'll wait for the camera to be off for that. Anyway, but this member of the delegation said, I wonder if Grindr works. So, and several people didn't really, hadn't seen Grindr, didn't know what Grindr was, and I'm gay married, so of course I don't know Grindr. And so we all hovered around this group of, of queer, lesbian, trans, gay folks from various backgrounds, and we were all hovered around someone's Grindr application. And it was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men, and we were in Ramallah at the time. And I remember we were all talking about, isn't this interesting to be in this place which is heavily confined and contained and constrained in so many different ways, and the politics of migration and space and relationships and sex and sexuality, etc., is so interesting, and yet here it is, just literally flowing down the iPhone. So then it elicited this whole other conversation with the lesbian women in the group in particular, who were pissed off that there wasn't an equivalent, sort of a lesbian equivalent to Grindr. And so for half the trip, and we're seeing horrifying things and oppressive things, and we're deeply engaged in these very serious political debates, seeing all sorts of stuff. And yet the one thing that ran throughout the week was we would check Grindr every day, and the women would talk about the branding and marketing scheme that they had for Cunt Hunt, which was going to be the sort of lesbian alternative to Grindr. And it was the one thing that gave us an enormous amount of laughter and joy over the course of this very difficult
go ahead with
trip. I don't know. Jasbir Puar, who's a wonderful queer post-colonial theorist, came up with
a question over
there. Anyway, so.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Sort of pass by the observation I was going to make. I haven't been online today, but I had heard or read about just what you described as being online. It's so long ago I can't remember where. That's right. Where it was. I mean, that information has been there.
Yeah, it was over a decade ago.
I know that raises
Yeah.
is the whole question about how information is exchanged and communicated.
Right.
Much more so than the actual information.
Yeah.
Well, and also what this article was pointing out was that, yes, this information has been there, and yet we still force that out of our minds because we want to think of this as a celebratory moment, and that's all, and not the complexity of it. So that's what this article was pointing out.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to go to the apps question, one of the early things that came up in the conversation you're facilitating were the existence of certain public places where men met to have sex on campus. Right. That, along with bar culture in general, is disappearing in the age of apps, where there isn't the same need for those kind of covert spaces where you don't know when, to be blunt, you can order in through the internet, through cell phone, through smartphone apps. I mean, that is the way that technology is changing social networking. And I was messaged on a different app, but an app yesterday morning from a guy I had to Google, I couldn't figure out whether it was Saudi Arabia, Libya, or Syria, but it was one of those three. Somebody just starting a conversation and what are the technological forces, the cultural forces at work here in channeling identity and desire through these networks?
Yeah. Do we have any other final questions before we wrap up? I have two final questions I want to ask you, and then we'll go. But they're quick, the quizzy kind of question. Anybody else have anything? Okay, you wrote a book, Deep Gossip. It's not really about gossip, we know that. But I want to gossip with you I want to ask you two questions as kind of gossip from someone who's been around the block and seen a lot. Who's the fiercest person you've encountered in your years, and who's the most fabulous person you've encountered? It could be the same person, but I want to know.
No, the fiercest would probably be Gail Rubin.
Why?
Because she's fiercest because she's fearless. Say anything and do anything, and at great risk to herself in days going by. When the advocacy of SM put her at odds with so many people. The most fabulous would be Lisa Dugan, I think.
And why is that?
How do you describe fabulous?
Yeah.
I'm now at a loss. I guess she's so unpredictable, and there can't possibly be a moment when she isn't entertaining. At least
Great, great. I just want to make one announcement before we close up here. There is a gender and sexuality seminar that meets on Thursday evenings from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Barker Center on perfecting friendship, perfecting democracy, same-sex romantic pairings as the basis for American freedom. And there's Michael Amico from Yale will be giving the next one on October 18th. And then there's also on April 12th this spring going to be an Matheson symposium, which will be a seminar series the seminar series will culminate in this symposium to celebrate the Matheson Chair and Henry being here with Jonathan Ned Katz and Blanche Wiesen-Cook, two very prominent members of our scholarly political communities. And so I hope there are flyers here, so please get them. But in closing, I just wanted to say, Henry, first of all, how great it is for us to have you here. Secondly, what a delight you are to have gotten to know, and every single person that I set out this about who had known you for many years, Arthur and Ian and a whole range of other people, said, oh my God, he's a mensch, he's the loveliest guy, I love Henry, I can't wait to, oh, he's here, and so your reputation precedes you, and it's just an honor to have gotten to know you and to have time with you, and thanks for being here.